Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for being here for what is set to be a fascinating panel on the future of hydrogen. My name is James Collington. I'm a former journalist now at Communications Advisory firm Brunswick Group, and I'm thrilled to be your moderator. First of all, I want to say a big thank you to Vincent Nelkens for putting this all together and hosting us here today. It's the perfect week to be discussing this topic, as business leaders from around the world and government leaders too converge on New York City to discuss a wide range of themes and solutions related to climate. Hydrogen intersects with several of those themes, including energy, transport, and industry. We have a great panel lineup here to discuss the barriers, solutions, and policies that stand between hydrogen reaching its full potential. Now to the panel. If we could just have you go down the line, introduce yourselves. Roman, if you want to kick off.
Sure, Roman Kramarchuk. I'm from S&P Global Commodity Insights. My background, I've worked with utilities before, worked at the government at the EPA before, but for the past 15, 20 years, I've been with S&P Global Platts and predecessor companies, really looking at clean energy, looking at the uptake and forecasting, looking at all the potential implications, the industry side, the emissions implications, the pricing implications, the investment levels, et cetera. So basically always looking at a cross-commodity integrated sense of where the energy sector is going. And if you're talking about cross-commodity and integrated, that's really what hydrogen's all about. It kind of it breaks down the silos and the traditional lines around which people think when they think of energy. So exciting to be here to discuss.
Thanks, Alan.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. I'm Alan Alexander. I'm a partner in the Energy Transactions and Projects Group here at Vincent & Elkins. I've been a practicing attorney for about 12 years now, and the entirety of that time I've worked on projects and transactions in the energy industry, from the extractive elements, upstream oil and gas, midstream joint ventures, acquisitions, divestitures, developments, a lot of downstream projects as well, typically in the petrochemical space, but throughout my career worked on a number of ammonia projects, which introduced me to the world of hydrogen supply at an industrial scale. In the past few years, like a lot of people, my practice has become much more diverse in a good way, including helping clients who are looking at producing low carbon hydrogen in various forms, sometimes traditional industrial applications, sometimes not. Also at Vincent & Elkins, I work with and head our hydrogen task force, which is helping our clients, understand kind of what hydrogen is, how it can be used, some of the laws, including some of the newly passed laws and the Inflation Reduction Act around it, and helping begin to make sense of that new legal landscape.
My name is Phil Pletka. I'm a managing director with Starwood Energy. I have spent my career in the energy space on the finance side, and we're a private equity firm. We invest in really along the energy value chain historically, on the power side, renewable side, transmission, and over the last 5-6 years we have diversified into what we call the energy transition aspects, renewable natural gas, hydrogen, and renewable fuels. The hydrogen aspect we started, I would say 3 years ago, where we started the construction of an ammonia facility in Texas, and are now looking at more hydrogen production engagement, really as part of thinking through to what extent hydrogen will or what part of the energy value chain hydrogen will contribute to on a global basis in the United States, and what role does ammonia play as part of that as well. So we're seeing a lot of activity in that area, and I'm excited to be here today. So thanks for having me.
Well, thank you all so much for being here. I think first, it's really important to set the scene in terms of what we mean by hydrogen. There's a variety of different types at different kind of stages of evolution in terms of usage and production. So Roman, I was hoping from your perspective as an analyst of the sector, if you could give us a quick whistle-stop tour of where things stand today on green, blue, grey hydrogen.
Yeah, there is a rainbow of hydrogen colors, which I'm sure if you're not familiar with, you'll probably hear about them. And it's I think the industry and the sector is wanting to taste all flavors of the rainbow. I don't know if that's the right analogy. Maybe Skittles or something. Maybe that's the right analogy. But so I mean, the core to remember about hydrogen is this is not a new industry. It's an industry that's been around forever. Mentioned ammonia, mentioned use of hydrogen refining. This is a 75 million tons a year industry. It's mostly created through steam methane reforming, which is essentially using natural gas as the feedstock. CO2 is released, and then the hydrogen is taken off that process. Now, gas can be a feedstock, and that is your traditional gray ammonia. So this is your natural gas steam methane reforming. Now, as I mentioned, the CO2 is released as part of the process. If you try to capture that CO2 to some degree, that gray ammonia can turn into blue ammonia, and that gives you gray and blue. Alternatives is that you can use also other fossil fuels as feedstocks to create the hydrogen. You can use coal, you can use oil, and that's where you get into the brown and black hydrogens. What you do with the coal is you gasify it, and that's you get the hydrogen through the water shift side of that, and that is essentially an even dirtier process. The thing to remember is conventional hydrogen production is a CO2 intensive process, particularly if it's made from coal, and mostly that sort of coal brown hydrogen is a Asia and China based phenomenon. But otherwise, most of the rest of hydrogen is being produced with natural gas, either ATR or SMR, and that is a more conventional process. Now, when we get into the rest of the colors, we have green hydrogen, which is essentially produced by using electricity to split a water molecule. If you think about what a water molecule is, it's H2 and an O. So, I mean, what happens when you split it is you essentially get that H2 coming off. It's a clean process if it's made from, but it's only as clean as the electricity you use to go into it. I like to use the analogy that hydrogen is a carrier of energy. It's not a, it's like electricity. Electricity is only as clean as as how it's made. So with hydrogen, the cleanliness of electrolysis-based hydrogen, it's green hydrogen if it is made with renewables, if it's made with zero carbon electricity. Otherwise, I mean, there are other forms of zero carbon electricity. You can also have, like, for example, nuclear, which can be used to generate the electricity. There's additional benefits of actually using the heat that comes out of the nuclear process, which can actually help with some of the efficiencies around the hydrogen process. I believe that's called turquoise.
Turquoise is methane pyrolysis.
Methane pyrolysis. Yeah. Okay, so
nuclear fission is pink.
Is pink. Yeah, apologies there. So that would be pink. That the turquoise would be pyrolysis, which essentially involves a process by which you actually get a solid CO2 coming out of the process. It's more expensive, and it's one that actually had been championed quite a bit by the Russian side for a number of reasons. And then there's actually yellow hydrogen being discussed directly produced via the solar. But at this point, I mean, from what we're seeing, and we'll talk about this down the road, but we maintain a database of a hydrogen production asset database where we track all of the different characteristics of new hydrogen announcements, and that comes from the technology, the offtake, the online dates, et cetera. A large majority of what we're seeing in terms of interest, and this is largely because of its zero carbon properties, is the green hydrogen. Because with the other forms, particularly blue hydrogen, there's concern about, is all the carbon being captured? How much of the emissions is coming from the upstream production of natural gas? Gas has to get to the SMR plant, and that involves leaks along the way. That involves, if you think about how gas is produced, various leaks along that whole chain. So that's my quick roundabout tour of your hydrogen skittles. So,
Hydrogen skittles.
Thank you. There are actually more colors than I knew going into this discussion, so I've learned something. Brilliant. Well, I know we're going to get into some of the practicalities, your limitations, etc., the policy side as we go on. But I wanted to kind of start with a point of optimism. So I'm interested in hearing from each of you on something about the potential of hydrogen that intrigues you, whether that's from a personal level, from the work you do, etc. I thought, Phil, we could start with you at the end there.
Yeah, I think hydrogen has the potential to really plug a significant hole as we think about decarbonizing the global economy over the next 20 or 30 years. As Roman mentioned, hydrogen has been around for a long time. It has been talked about as a potential fuel for transportation a long time, but has been edged out by the emergence of electric vehicles, and really didn't get to a scale that many had hoped for. But now there seems to be a lot of push from a global perspective to continue to develop the hydrogen economy, the hydrogen technology, and the hydrogen infrastructure to help fill that gap. As was mentioned before, hydrogen can be used as a low carbon or no carbon or zero carbon fuel or energy carrier. So from the perspective of being able to have another resource available to produce no carbon or zero carbon fuel, I think is going to be a huge advantage. And what hydrogen can do, it can take the place of natural gas, right? So when we think about decarbonizing the economy over the next, I think many countries have announced that they're looking to decarbonize by 2050. So we have about 20 to 30 years to get there. That is going to get achieved by continued build out of wind, solar, battery storage, but we will need firm capacity resources in order to provide a stable, reliable electricity grid that can react to changes in supply and demand. And so for that, we'll need, unless there's a change or new technology that's coming out, we'll need natural gas-fired power generation that can react quickly or potentially provide baseload power generation. So one use case there is being able to supplement the natural gas fired generation with hydrogen. So it's part of the solution. The potential is significant, and the demand ramp could be very meaningful in order to kind of, build out that infrastructure in order to provide that as an energy source in the future.
Great, thank you, Adam.
I would follow on what Phil says, and part of what I find very intriguing and interesting about hydrogen is just it's very pliable. It's an element with which you can do a lot of different things, which avails itself to thinking, you could say, outside the box in some ways about how exactly you're going to incorporate hydrogen into your economy. That perhaps self-serving given my experience, but I've done a lot of work, developing ammonia projects in my career, and there's a lot of talk about, and I think it's even progressed beyond talk of ammonia being a form of carrier of hydrogen, if you will, and in some respects, the ammonia itself actually being the fuel that gets combusted and burned. You can combine it. They also talk about doing something similar with methanol. There's the possible of, mixing hydrogen into existing natural gas lines. It does present some technical challenges. They're working on, actually, as Phil said, combusting it, developing turbines that can run, just combusting a mixture of hydrogen and natural gas or hydrogen alone. So it's extremely pliable, and there's a lot of different ways you can think about using it. And I think what we need to do on a societal level, I guess, is begin to put our creativity to work to think about some of the things we can do with this. What can we mix it with? What's the best way to transport it? What are the best ways to produce it? How can we use it? That's going to be a big question. There's some uses now that are pretty well known. But there are some ways we could potentially use it larger and larger scale in the future. So from my perspective, it's comparing it to where kind of like what utility scale wind and solar was 20 or 30 years ago. I mean, those are electrons. You interconnect to the grid and off you go. Hydrogen, unfortunately, isn't that easy to get into circulation. But fortunately, there's a lot of different things you can do with it to potentially find a way to use it and get it into circulation. So that's, to me, is just kind of intriguing to sit around and think about all the different ways, we may be able to mix, match, synthesize and use it.
For sure. And then last but not least, Roman.
Okay, I mean, I'll cheat a little bit because I'll take a little bit off of what our previous speakers have mentioned. I'm pretty excited about the power sector applications because if you think about it, hydrogen, if you go with the green hydrogen route, you've got electrolyzers, which are, I think people underestimate how big the potential demand on the power sector will be from electrolyzers. What that means is that if that demand can be somewhat flexible, that can be part of balancing a very renewables heavy grid. So if you think about the challenges of moving to very high renewables, it's you have to deal with the troughs when the wind doesn't blow, when the sun doesn't shine. And then you also have to deal with the peaks where guess what, you just don't need all that much solar. We're essentially curtailing solar in California and China and Germany because it's coming at the wrong time. So what electrolyzers can do is essentially take that zero cost and under the IRA negative cost power and translate that into a medium that can actually be useful. And the other part of it is when you're talking about the troughs, that's also long duration. I mean, lithium-ion batteries are great. They're great for frequency response, 1 hour in. They're good for 4 hours out, but essentially you have to keep building additional batteries. There's not adding additional batteries to get that more storage. So really excited about the power side. The one other side of hydrogen, this kind of highlights how versatile it is I think, hydrogen in steel making is a fascinating application. Because when we've done our analysis, we've looked at where you can get the carbon reductions per kilogram of hydrogen, where you can get the best carbon reductions per kilogram of hydrogen, it's from the steelmaking process, because you're also taking advantage of the reducing and the chemical aspects of it, as well as the fuel aspects of it. And in that case, you're replacing a lot of coal. Mm-hmm. So it goes back to the versatility. We can go on about all the other sectors, but I think time and the markets will tell.
I think that's right. I mean, all the coal that's used in steel production as a reduction agent, that just goes away and you use hydrogen instead.
And I think a lot of the media coverage, and in particular critical media coverage, is very, very focused on green hydrogen. Mm-hmm. We hear less about this side of things, but do you just want to stick with green hydrogen for a second? And I know we kind of talked about this in the build-up to this panel about some of the practicalities of green hydrogen. You were saying it's only as green as the electricity you put in. So Alan, I was wondering if you could talk us through a little bit of that, some of the stuff around ring fencing and then the water supply and some of those other components.
Yeah, so producing green hydrogen is a relatively straightforward process compared to some other industrial chemical process you might be familiar with. You can extremely dumb it down, and I'd ask any engineers here to not get too upset with what I'm about to say, but you just need water, you need an electricity supply, you electrocute the water, and oxygen and hydrogen are produced. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's the lawyer's explanation. So what do you need? You need renewable electrons and water. But the practicalities or the challenges, you can almost think about begin to present themselves when, where do you have a lot of solar resource? Places like the middle of Australia, Arizona, and interestingly enough, those places don't have a lot of water. How much water do you need for hydrogen? Well, the ratio is 9 kilograms of water per 1 kilogram of hydrogen. So very quickly you get to the point where you have a very water intensive process. Not to say that's not a challenge, it can be overcome. We've done very good at, basically living in the deserts and adapting deserts. But it is something to, keep in mind when developing large scale green hydrogen projects, is that the renewable resource may not be co-located with water and vice versa. The other one, and this is going to get into something I think we might discuss a little bit later, but gets to, when you have renewable power, do you have to have your, wind farm or solar farm directly connected to your electrolyzers? Or can you get into questions about whether some sort of virtual PPA or purchasing power off the grid and, somehow greening it up with RECs or otherwise should be permitted if you're doing a green hydrogen project? There are people that argue that yes. The IRA as a statute isn't entirely clear on it. And based on some conversations I've had with some colleagues in Europe, it seems like in Europe, they're leaning towards actually ring fencing green hydrogen production facilities with, the renewable facilities, the renewable power facilities that are going to provide the power to those electrolyzers. So it's an open question, and I think it's something we're going to need to work out the next few months in the United States, and hopefully, we can get to a solution that's a little bit more favorable to the production of green hydrogen, through the use of virtual PPAs, renewable power over here, not necessarily connected to your electrolyzer process. Other practicalities to keep in mind is, there's loss associated with converting renewable electrons to hydrogen, and then if you take that hydrogen and convert it into ammonia, there's going to be power loss associated with that. If you crack the ammonia and separate out the hydrogen, further loss. So at each stage of the process, there's some degree of degradation. That's not to say we can't improve the technology and make it more efficient, but at present, it is a factor to keep in mind that not every electron that goes into an electrolyzer comes out as an equal amount of hydrogen that can be converted to electricity on the other side. Another point that, maybe I'll let my colleagues, who've done more on grid interconnects than I have discuss, is to produce green hydrogen at scale. And by scale, I mean, potentially industrial level applications would require an incredible amount of power, gigawatt, scale power. Of course, you can get an interconnect, but that's a lot of power going into the grid at one place that may need to then come out at another place. For grid infrastructure, for example, in Texas and ERCOT, if you have 1 gigawatt going in one place and coming out at another, what are the ramifications for that if you're next to a population center or another load center? So none of this is, by any means fatal, with every technology and application has, practicalities that need to be worked through, but green hydrogen does present some, in terms of the resources involved and the infrastructure needed.
I guess one thing I just would like to add for perspective is that every kilowatt hour, megawatt hour of renewables that goes into making hydrogen is not going into cleaning up the grid. So if you think about, from a policy perspective, why do you want green hydrogen? You want it essentially for the pathway for decarbonization. And if you still have natural gas combined cycles, if you still have coal units on your grid, that is actually once again from a carbon efficiency perspective, depending on what the end use of the hydrogen is. Like I said, steel can be really carbon good. Some of the other applications are less so. But if you still have gas combined cycles, if you still have coal plants on your grid, from a policy perspective, from a kind of decarbonization perspective, that's one of the rationales for why Europe was considering ring fencing, because they didn't want, while they still had lignite in Germany, fired in Germany, they didn't want to use renewables, shift them into hydrogen, go through all the transformations we just talked about, and lose energy in the process where they can still just replace the power sector. So that's one of the sort of bigger challenges in terms of some of these discussions and why ring fencing is being considered. But then the reality is, that does place questions because if there are constraints on how many wind farms, how many solar panels can go in, but you don't want it to turn into a discussion. Do we want to build renewables for power or for hydrogen? You kind of want to be able to do both, which is why not ring fencing with some of these other attributes, being able to bring in carbon offsets or being able to bring RECs is a way to work around that.
Yeah. Just to add to this, I think, even though there's significant potential, I think what some of these comments alluded to is that we're kind of early stage in trying to figure out, right, what the supply or the demand picture will look like from a hydrogen perspective, and just some of the things that were mentioned here, and just maybe give a little bit more color around it. So, one of the things we look at is scaling existing technologies from a hydrogen perspective, right? Hydrogen usually has been produced on a green basis with electrolyzers on a much smaller scale. So depending on the technology, I think, and these numbers might be outdated, but maybe the largest electrolyzer, alkaline electrolyzer, was maybe 150 megawatts that is operating today. and some of the newer technologies, the largest maybe 10 megawatts. So now we're talking about putting gigawatt or 2 gigawatt facilities in place. Now they're all individual units, so you can kind of stack them up. But all of that usually comes with unintended consequences that we have to think through from an engineering perspective. The power supply being one, Alan alluded to it. If we add a gigawatt or two to, let's just say Texas, to the Texas grid, that means we're adding 1 to 2.5% of the peak demand load in ERCOT in one substation. And interconnection study has to be done in order to figure out what that means to the grid stability. Is the transmission available to get the power there? And all of those things take time. So we have to kind of work through it. Again, they're not fatal by any means, but we have to work through it, and it just takes time. Similarly, as the grid becomes sort of more renewable, there could be fluctuations on the voltage depending on, solar coming, coming down in the afternoon, wind picking up, natural gas-fired generation coming online, and depending on the technology, electrolyzers don't like necessarily those voltage swings, and they like more stable power supplies. So those are things we have to think through.
I think if I can just add, then all of these potential additions are also happening while EVs are also being added to the grid in a very real way, creating concerns. So, if you think about energy transition, so much of it is electrification, and this is presenting, between EVs and hydrogen, major challenges.
Yeah. Now, what that means is there's a lot of capital opportunities to resolve those issues if again the demand is going to be there, which we believe is the case. But those are just some of the challenges we have to think through. And as projects come online and get developed, I think we'll find solutions to all of those. But it's just things we need to keep in mind as we kind of develop business plans, develop the cost for those things, because and we'll get into this a little bit later, but the supply and the demand is going to sort of move in parallel here a little bit, right? So green hydrogen is going to be interesting as a decarbonizing fuel. It's going to be more expensive than any other solution, so people are going to be willing to have to pay for it. Now, how much it's going to cost, it sort of depends on all these supply side issues that we have to work through, on top of inflation and those sort of things that we have had to deal with here as of late. So I think supply demand is going to develop on a large scale in parallel, and just some engineering challenges and so forth that we know today we're gonna have to work through, but there's going to be probably plenty that we're not aware of today. That will come up as projects are being developed and come online.
So the Inflation Reduction Act has been mentioned kind of once already, and while we're on the demand landscape, I was wondering, Phil, if you could chat a little bit about the impact of that bill and the funding coming through, both from that and then previously the billions coming through from the infrastructure package as well. How's that affecting the state of the demand landscape in the US? So I think there's the domestic demand aspect and the global demand aspect. What was a challenge up until recently was the supply and the cost of, now sticking with the green hydrogen theme, being able to provide green hydrogen at a reasonable price to create the demand. Depending on the return requirements and capital costs, but probably green hydrogen is in $4 to $6 per kilogram range. Gray hydrogen might be in $1 range. So you have a pretty significant spread, right? And blue is probably somewhere in between, probably closer to the $1 than the $5 or $6 range. So what the IRA does, it provides incentives to lower the cost of green ammonia and make it more competitive with the other sources. Now, it's still significantly higher, right? And on an MMBTU equivalent basis, I think $5 is close to $45 of natural gas, so maybe like a 9 multiplier or so. And so if you think about
hydrogen as a substitute for natural gas in a way from an energy perspective, right? You either need to be willing to pay quite a bit more for that carbon neutral aspect, or you need to sell it into an environment where natural gas prices are, $45 or higher.
Europe or Asia.
That makes Europe or Asia a very logical target there. Now in the US, so far, we have seen, for example, an announcement recently where Plug Power and Amazon have announced a deal, right, where Plug Power will provide green hydrogen to power some of the transportation fleet for Amazon. I think some of the more near-term demand is going to come out of Europe and Asia because, in addition to decarbonizing their entire grid by 2050 and becoming carbon neutral by 2050, the added aspect there is energy security as well. We've seen that in particular in Europe in recent months with what's going on in Ukraine. So Europe is trying to add, and they obviously get a lot of their natural gas from Russia. So they're trying to diversify their energy supply picture, and at the same time decarbonizing. So green or blue hydrogen is a logical step for them. Same with Asia. I think they are looking for ways to decarbonize. They don't necessarily have the natural gas resources, and for them, it's going to be a big aspect of the energy portfolio as well. It's going to be driven ultimately by government regulation and incentives. So and how much the government is willing to pay or subsidize in order to import green hydrogen in the form of ammonia or blue hydrogen in the form of ammonia from international markets. I think Europe is going to draw a lot from the Middle East and the US. Asia has opportunities to fill that demand from Australia, the Middle East, and the United States as well. So that global demand is going to be driven by the attractiveness of that is going to be driven by the spread between international natural gas prices and US natural gas price. And even though we have gone up to $10 now from $2 just a few years ago, the spread to the international markets is still there. So it's still an attractive proposition. And that I think will drive some of the near-term demand. In the US, and I could go on for hours, we can talk about the infrastructure that's needed, but I'll pause here and
and I think we'll just before we jump onto the global point there, keen to get your kind of regulatory brain involved here, Alan. We talked. Yeah, sorry. We talked about the Inflation Reduction Act, but that's only kind of one piece of the puzzle. I'm just wondering if you could give a bit of a kind of broader, take a step back view of the regulatory landscape in the US, other components we may not have touched on just then.
Yeah, I mean, any project of this sort of magnitude is going to have a lot of different permitting and regulatory requirements to keep in mind. I could go on about citing endangered species studies. Air permits may or may not be required with a green project, but certainly would be required with a blue one. Depending on where you're building your facility, you could have, wetlands permits issues to address. All of those are kind of ever present with just about any project. And I'm looking at my environmental colleague here, who's probably rattling through all the things I've left off. That's why I'd call her. But as it relates to building out the infrastructure that Phil alluded to, one of the things that's always intrigued me about hydrogen and ammonia pipelines is that there's not really a cohesive regulatory structures, that would apply to building an interstate hydrogen or ammonia pipeline. When we think about interstate transportation of crude oil or natural gas, it's the Interstate Commerce Act or the Natural Gas Act, and you're talking about the FERC, possibly the DOE. Everyone knows kind of what that landscape looks like. There are interstate ammonia pipelines, a few of them. And there are, interstate, mostly in and around the Gulf Coast, hydrogen networks. But it's not entirely clear, that there's one, agency you go to develop that pipeline network. And this goes to the point if we're going to begin to develop interstate hydrogen network to use it more as an energy carrier. The threshold answer is it's some combination of PHMSA, the Surface Transportation Board, and the EPA. Great, you don't got to go deal with FERC, but at the same time, you got to deal with 3 agencies. So, it could present its own set of challenges. As the other, I think, kind of attractive area to think about as it relates to using hydrogen potentially as a transportation fuel, and I believe this is happening in California and other states with low carbon fuel programs, you need to think about everything involved with creating the pathways, to generate that product, to use it as a vehicle fuel, which requires a tremendous amount of work on the front end, a lot of consultants, a lot of carbon intensity studies, working closely with CARB, follow-up studies later once your facility is in operation to then get a permanent pathway and permanent CI score approved. Looking at my other, colleagues over here, there's been some talk, and maybe they'll correct me if I'm wrong, about whether or not to approve a RIN pathway for using hydrogen as some sort of, vehicle fuel. That again would be a further layer of regulation that, anyone interested in developing a project for that reason would need to comply with. And obviously it'd be very key, because if you're going to go to the trouble of developing a hydrogen facility to produce hydrogen for use as a vehicle fuel, the incentives in terms of low carbon fuel standard incentives and RINs are part of what make that economic and attractive. So it's a huge regulatory patchwork, depending on what you're going to do, what you're going to build, how it's going to work. The IRA we can touch on a little bit later and delve into some of that, but it's, an added layer as well, because the IRA is what helps solve some of what Phil was alluding to in the supply problem in terms of getting hydrogen production to a point where it's not as, not as expensive to produce. Therefore, more people are incentivized to possibly produce it, than would previously have been the case.
Great, thank you for running through that. And I know kind of to this point, we focused pretty heavily on the US, but you mentioned there, Roman, Europe and Asia, in particular when it comes to the marketplace you might want to sell green hydrogen into. So wondering if you could just explain a little bit about the demand landscape you're seeing in those 2 regions.
Yeah, I wanted to touch upon, it was mentioned the arbitrage opportunities, and the idea that hydrogen or ammonia, whichever is better at carrying hydrogen, is going to become a global market. Is this going to be a commodity? Are we going to have a commodity price? Is it going to be, Henry Hub, Brent, and Rotterdam, or not to pick winners or anything, but or pick your spot. And so something that we have started doing already 2 years ago is essentially having daily price assessments for multiple technologies across the world. So if you want to know daily prices based on inputs for different types of hydrogen, different technologies of hydrogen, and then also we've created a carbon neutral hydrogen benchmark that considers different options to get to a zero carbon hydrogen solution, and that's also on a daily basis, and then also a blue ammonia benchmark. So given those things on a daily basis, if we get to the point where this is a traded market, there are considerations of these are the arbitrage opportunities. This is where the hydrogen needs to go because there's demand for it. And this is where the hydrogen is being produced because there's supply for it. And this is the exciting part of moving from what has historically been either inside the fence production or deals or just bilateral deals. Going to the demand side of that is really looking at what a lot of the rest of the world, a lot of key European and Asian countries have done is they have hydrogen strategies, which basically set targets for how much hydrogen demand and in what sectors they're looking to achieve it. The UK came out with one, the EU came out with one as well. South Korea has one, China has one. These are all countries that have essentially highlighted how they intend to be using the hydrogen. Some of them have production targets as well. And then the issue really then is how much of that is going to be domestic, how much of that are they going to have to import? And that's where these sort of markets for hydrogen become very interesting because it moves from being something that is agreed to between two parties in a localized environment to something that, as I said, will it be the next, Henry Hub or the next Brent?
Yeah, and it's not a regulatory question, but it's similar to what you're talking about, Roman. One of the things I wonder about a lot is, everyone in this room now, if you paid attention to hydrogen, you know what green means, you know what blue means. But one of the things the Inflation Reduction Act kind of bore out is, it's not really is it blue, is it green? It's what's the carbon intensity of the hydrogen that you produced. And so, you could have a green facility that for some reason isn't quite, is less carbon intensive than another for, maybe they get more green, maybe they get more renewable power at certain times than others. And so, there's going to be markets and places develop, and then are those markets going to price different carbon intensity scores, hydrogens or ammonia, more or less than others? And it's also related to the question of like, sure, you can say it's blue or green, but, and this is one of the things we're encountering in the documentation, like how does a seller of that give, some sort of representation as to this project or this product is produced with 95% of the carbon captured that a buyer can rely upon? And the truth of the matter is it's still being worked out. There's no one coherent way to, do it yet. I've seen a variety of different strategies.
And if I could just give a little pitch, because we're part of an initiative, the Open Hydrogen Initiative, which is essentially around developing standards around, and that's something we're doing with GTI and Nettle.
Right.
It's a joint initiative. So.
Right. And I think we'd all benefit from it because once there are it doesn't have to be one standard, but once there's a standard, some standards that kind of coalesce, you can see right now if you're developing a blue or green hydrogen facility, is there some activist out there who's going to accuse your organization of greenwashing because it doesn't have all the, carbon offsets and attributes that you claim it does. If you have some certification methodologies or a group of them that are relied upon, that it helps in that respect.
So I want to shift gears a little bit to a subject that I know will probably interest lots of people in this room and watching too, which is the opportunity sets you're seeing right now in terms of providing development capital, acquisitions if you're maybe an energy company and things right now. So particularly here, maybe to kick off from your, as you look out into the world of hydrogen, what excites you, what's coming down the pipeline, what's investable now versus what will be, you hope, investable in a few years' time?
So I'll start on the global market and the ammonia side, because that's where we have made an investment already. I do believe that will be the more immediate, tangible, larger scale opportunity that is transactable from our perspective. And I kind of draw some parallels to the LNG market and how that developed. It was developed bilaterally. There was certainly the demand in international markets, and the U.S. had access to, even though we started as importing natural gas, but the U.S. became a very attractive supply basin for cheap natural gas relative to the global market. So I think that will continue to develop. And again, as Roman alluded to, there's going to be incentives in international countries to import hydrogen in the form of ammonia and use it for all sorts of purposes. Japan, South Korea, they're going to use it for co-firing of coal plants as to lower their CO2 footprint. Europe is going to have different usage. So I think that's one of the near-term opportunities. In terms of the pure hydrogen production, I think there's going to be a lot of development capital needs and different business strategies that are going to develop and evolve. So there's the blue hydrogen angle, which will follow, to the traditional ATR, SMR technologies, carbon sequestration, and then, selling that blue hydrogen to industrial users, to potentially power plants, to ammonia producers. And that is going to be, I think, also a potential near-term opportunity. Now, there are a few very large-scale industrial gas producers that are very well positioned to make investments in in that aspect. On the green side, just considering some of the challenges that we have been talking about earlier, I think that's more early stage development capital. And people are going to develop different business plans, and some are going to be successful, others are going to fail. And I would say over the next 5 years or so, we will have a much better pictures of where the sort of de-risk capital needs are going to be. There's also going to be opportunities in the infrastructure around it, anything that will touch green hydrogen. So obviously, renewable wind and solar, pipelines. I think we have maybe 1,500 miles of hydrogen pipelines in the United States, 2.5 million miles of natural gas pipelines. So that gives you an idea of the magnitude. Hydrogen fueling stations, all those sort of things. I think we basically have to build out a whole infrastructure akin to natural gas and oil if we believe that hydrogen is going to be a big participant in our economy going forward. Not today, not tomorrow, but we're growing into it, and it will require significant capital investments. So I think on the hydrogen production, green hydrogen production in particular, it's going to be more development capital, but that will grow very quickly in concrete opportunities as we're working through some of the issues that we mentioned earlier, which will help solidify the demand picture and get us a better view on the cost of producing and transporting green hydrogen in the domestic market.
Yeah, I mean, to add to what Phil said, top-down approach, if we're going to need more electricity and pipelines to move it, so linear infrastructure. On what are the immediate demand pictures, I can see, and we're working on a couple of projects in the mobility sector in LCFS states, some of which are green projects, others of which are actually kind of an interesting use of small-scale SMRs fueled by renewable natural gas or sustainably sourced natural gas, which, although technically gray would be the color, when you run an analysis on it, the carbon intensity score tends to be pretty low, kind of sub 20, sub 15, and those become economic. People were working on projects like that kind of before the IRA, mostly due to the incentives associated with low carbon fuel standards. And potentially with the IRA, there might be an avenue to further incentivize the development of those sorts of projects. That, of course, depends on hydrogen's use in the mobility sector, which outside of Southern California or large fleets such as what have Amazon and Walmart, that it could be pretty nichey for a while. Some other areas will need to develop. Energy storage is intriguing, notwithstanding the kind of the round trip power loss issues that we discussed previously. If the infrastructure can get built out to transport hydrogen to a place where there's a large underground salt dome or something, you could potentially store hydrogen underground, release essentially stored renewable power in the form of hydrogen for combustion at a time when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing. And as Roman alluded to earlier, I think another potential use for green hydrogen is going to be as a reduction agent in steel production. Similar to that, I've talked with a couple of developers who are attempting to find a way to do, green hydrogen electrolyzers by their nature are kind of modular, but kind of smaller scale, low carbon or green hydrogen. Not to displace all the hydrogen needed by, say, a refinery, but if a large refiner has a net zero commitment, they could replace some of their hydrogen requirements with on-site modularized type of green hydrogen production. The developer I was talking to has got a very interesting technology and business proposal, and I think there could be a niche there. Again, it's not going to be completely replacing gray hydrogen, but displacing a little bit of it. Those are kind of what I see as the immediate opportunities for development. And as Phil said, you're going to need a lot of development capital. We're going to need to make sure the returns work for the investors. But those are the opportunities I see, at least in the immediate term. From there, what the next 5 or 10 years look like. I'm not sure, but if I want to kind of see what direction we're going with hydrogen, sometimes I tell people, look at what Europe's doing now, and we might be 5 to 10 years behind that. So,
yeah, I mean, I think the interesting point, the Europeans are a little different. I think the European refiners and integrated oil companies, they are actually looking to at ESG concerns. They're looking at trying to hit their targets around carbon intensity and absolute carbon. And so, yeah, in the refining process, we might remember refining and ammonia are the two biggest chunks right now. Everything else is kind of very small. It's going to grow, but for now, hydrogen is refining and ammonia are the two main use cases. So dropping and substituting there is a big deal. Did want to comment on just the relative size of this industry, because as I mentioned, we regularly track our announcement production database. Basically, if you think of the global pure hydrogen being in the 75 million ton per year demand level, about 3 years ago, the low carbon green and blue hydrogen made up less than 1 million tons of all total announcements. We're up to 50 million tons. So just and total market 75 million tons, announcements at this point upwards of 50 million tons. 2 years ago, less than 1 million ton. So, and just anecdotally from as we're seeing announcements and things, a lot of that was in places like Australia and places like Europe, less so in the United States, but we're already seeing an uptick of some deals and a lot and more interest in North America. We'd expect that to also take place. So yeah, we're just going to keep monitoring, tracking the deals, and look. The interesting thing is also looking to see what the offtakes are for those particular announcements, because that'll give a sense as to, and they are very different. You know, it's interesting. Like a lot of the blue hydrogen projects tend to go more into replacing incumbent hydrogen needs, whereas more of the green hydrogen projects are the ones that are going into more, I'm not going to say uncharted, but new ground for hydrogen demand. So you do have a bit of that dichotomy, which is also interesting to watch.
Yeah, and I don't know if this is going to happen or not, but one of the things I've always thought, would really be a bit of a game changer, at least for blue hydrogen and therefore blue ammonia, would be if in essentially in agriculture, product differentiation, results to distinguish, essentially wheat and corn that was produced with, low carbon ammonia, therefore low carbon fertilizers, and wheat and corn that is not. That's going to depend on, something similar to what happened 20, 30 years ago when, as consumers, we decided that organic food was worth a price premium. If we as consumers decide that low carbon food is worth a price premium, that could be very big for a hydrogen economy at the end of the day.
That's actually part of a trend that we're also seeing in terms of low carbon crude, low carbon LNG deals, low carbon aluminum. All of these commodities are essentially getting low carbon alternatives, and all of them could benefit from a clean hydrogen input.
So we've got a few minutes until we're going to turn to the Q&A portion. But before we jump onto that, just wanted to give each of you a chance to share kind of one key takeaway from this discussion. We've covered a lot of ground. One key thing that you'd like to leave the audience both here and virtually with today. So Phil, if you want to start with you at the end there. Sorry, hot seat.
I think as part of, and this is just not just hydrogen specific, but given I think the carbon reduction goals that are announced globally, whether it's green hydrogen, renewable natural gas, renewable fuels, I think we're sort of at the beginning of a transition that I wouldn't say is unprecedented, but it is going to be a game changer for the energy sector. And when we think about the power space, it went from coal to natural gas to renewables, and this is sort of the next step. And I would expect that transition to be very similar in terms of scale, and there's just a lot of global push behind it, and that will, I think, help accelerate it, and it will be exciting to be part of over the next decade or two.
Thanks. Going next.
I'll go. I guess I'll be very narrow in my thought. It's my impression is how darn powerful the IRA incentives for hydrogen are. I mean, if you look at what they are for the cleanest hydrogen, was it $3 per kilogram? Now,
potentially,
our own projections of what it's going to cost to produce hydrogen from renewables by 2030 is less than $3. So what are we talking about? We're talking about free hydrogen. I mean, just to think about what the implications of that are. Not every hydrogen is going to meet that threshold. Not every kilogram of hydrogen is going to meet that threshold. But the absolute subsidies that are being proposed are incredibly supportive for the production of hydrogen, incredibly so. Now, if that was the intention to kickstart the industry, it certainly will. It certainly, because it's just the opportunities, particularly if renewable costs continue to decline, which we expect they will, then, right now we were talking about, depending on where you are, and you can check our price assessments for all the different locations in the world of how much hydrogen costs. If you can get green hydrogen right now for $3 and you can get the tax credit for the same amount, then that looks like a really good deal.
Well, yeah, and there's the ability as well to, transfer. But what I was going to say is the renewable generation can still qualify for ITCs and PTCs, yes. And then the hydrogen can as well.
Yep.
So
it's additive.
You can't stack 45Q with it, but right. Yeah, you can. So my one takeaway, just going back to the IRA, because it's kind of, I guess, the biggest development recently, is, just supply and demand. Low carbon hydrogen faced problems on both sides of the supply and demand curve. It was expensive to produce, and kind of, I don't want to say because of that, probably a myriad of reasons. There also, outside of the industrial and traditional uses for it, wasn't much of a demand for it. The IRA is huge for attacking the supply side of the question. It's now, potentially much cheaper than it was before. I don't want to say at parity with gray, but closer, to produce low carbon hydrogen sources. That's got to help the economics of a transaction, but for, to help the economics of a transaction, there needs to be a transaction. So that gets into the demand side. And so I think now it's time, as policymakers, deal makers, all of the above, to begin to, now that we can source this, potentially in a cost competitive way, think about ways to use it.
Great, thank you. Well, we're going to shift on to Q&A now. So any of you watching virtually, please do submit your questions into the chat, and the technical team will make sure they get through to us, and then open to those in the room as well. So if we go, Lydia, head start.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone. Really appreciate the insights from the panel. My name is Ivana Jemelkova. I'm a partner with FTI Consulting, a global business advisory firm. And if you can believe it, we have been in hydrogen for well over 10 years, which, I'll let you make your own view on that. Seen obviously momentous developments, worked with clients along the value chain, and among other, we helped build and grow the Hydrogen Council CEO Coalition. So quite familiar, and I know many of you are as well. The Hydrogen Council just released their most recent State of Hydrogen Industry report together with McKinsey this morning. And I took away two figures, which I think illustrate beautifully the balancing act that you tried to perform here between optimism and excitement for what's ahead versus the reality that is obviously complex. Two figures. More than 600 projects have been announced globally. Only 10% of them are at mature stage. So final investment decision, similar sort of stage of maturity. With all those momentous developments in the US, in Europe, and elsewhere in the world, how quickly do you think the needle will move? Are we in for yet another period of sort of cautious tiptoeing around the technology? Are you expecting sort of a gold rush into hydrogen? And do we have everything we need to actually really significantly accelerate the pace of deployment beyond what's been mentioned here? Again, the balancing act on risks and opportunities. 50-30 views.
So the question for those joining us virtually, so you can hear it, is extent to which kind of a gold rush into hydrogen is coming up, and do we have the infrastructure and resources to support that? I'm happy for any of you to jump in as you see fit.
I've noticed that there have been a lot of announcements, and not every project that gets announced gets done. But I think pairing your figures with Roman's, if of the 50 million tons that have been announced, if only 10% get done, that's 5 million, and that's a five-fold increase over where we were a year ago. So is it going to be a gold rush and change the world overnight? I've never thought so, but I thought it was going to be a, contributing factor to a decarbonized economy. And probably more of a significant one. I do a tremendous amount of work in renewable natural gas too, and I think that's, contributive, but probably not to the same degree that, blue and green hydrogen could be. So it's going to be a patchwork of things that get us there, and I think it's, this is going to be one of them. The other thing, is it going to happen tomorrow? At least as it relates to a blue hydrogen project, you've probably got what, Phil, if you're lucky, a year and a half of pre-development, and then another 3+ years of construction. So, if you decided today you wanted to do one, if you got lucky, you're coming online in 4.5 or 5 years, probably a little bit longer. And that's blue, and that's really the only way to make it at scale at this point. I don't know those same exact figures for, everything that would be involved, a big renewable facility with all the electrolyzers and all that, maybe a shorter timeline, I'm not sure. But it's going to take time. It's going to take a lot of investment. Going to be a lot of, new types of permitting and, regulations that need to be navigated. The IRA is great, but still no one has actually qualified and received a credit yet. We're going to have to figure out actually how to do that, how to transfer them, do all these other things. So, it's going to take time. I think we'll begin to see, we'll begin to see deals, I think, pretty soon. We probably won't, we'll probably begin to see, results, 3, 4, 5 years from now. Are all of these 600 projects going to get done? I would like to, but it'd be a lot of legal work associated with it, but, probably not. So, but it's a sign that people are thinking about, how to deploy hydrogen technologies. And, I really don't want to discourage people from do that. More projects are better. Some will get done, some won't. So
my thought is that at least in the next year or two, we should be looking to Europe. I think there's a great urgency there for molecules versus electrons. There's a lot of gas to be made up, and RNG is going to be part of the solution there, but hydrogen is looking to be part of the solution. And there's an urgency there. The way Germany and other countries are fast tracking a lot of things, including LNG import and other things. There is a rush to get things done there that may seem very un-European sometimes, but I think that's the one thing that I'd say is kind of look out for that. The other piece of it is also, we track electrolyzer manufacturing, because we are not. That's another. When you talk about the uptick in the projects, you need to have the electrolyzers. You need to have the materials and minerals that go into the electrolyzers as well. So that's another thing that we are looking to make sure. There's a big step up coming in the next year or two. If that's happening, that's something we're tracking, because particularly when you start having targets that are very aggressive and competing incentives on both sides of the Atlantic and perhaps in South Korea and elsewhere, you then start bidding on a limited number of assets if they're not built out quickly enough. So that's a concern. I'll just add to the concerns. So
I think we had a question over here, gentleman there.
Quick question. Where does hydrogen fusion fit into
So just repeating question for the virtual audience, it is, where does hydrogen fusion fit into everything we're discussing here? Any takers?
I can take a stab. Hydrogen fusion would essentially be a provision of nuclear energy. At this point, any fusion reactions are still energy negative, from my understanding, meaning they can do it, but it takes so much more energy than comes out of the process. I think that's more of a nuclear question than a hydrogen question. So that was.
Any other? Yes.
Can you talk about some of the practicalities of converting the hydrogen?
So a question for those joining us virtually is, can you talk about the practicalities of converting LNG infrastructure to involve hydrogen?
Converting LNG infrastructure? Is that?
Yeah, to the terminals, to the pipelines.
Okay.
So the LNG aspect, I think, shipping hydrogen from is not the most efficient way to get it, on the water, just because of, how much you have to compress it in order to get the volume small enough to get on a ship at a scale that's significant enough to get the cost down, right? Yeah. So I think from that perspective, it is going to be probably ammonia or methanol that will be the key carriers on a global market, and that'll be more efficient way to do it. Whether or not the ammonia will then be cracked back into hydrogen, I think that question is still outstanding. That's a technology that really hasn't been pursued because it wasn't necessary. So when ammonia was shipped, it was usually used as ammonia or as a feedstock for something else, and it was not necessary to crack it back into hydrogen. So there's going to be investment into that to see if that's makes sense. Today, whether you use hydrogen or whether you crack hydrogen, or you use the ammonia that is ultimately delivered, I think that becomes sort of an energy almost equivalent equation today. But to the extent that technology improvements are there, you might want to crack it back into hydrogen. In terms of the U.S. infrastructure, it's going to be, I think, case specific. We can't use the existing pipeline for hydrogen transport just because it's a small molecule. It's going to leak. It's going to result in steel cracking for normal steel pipes that are used for natural gas. So we might be able to introduce 5-10% into the natural gas stream to avoid those issues, but I think that's the limit. So then the question becomes, how do we best deliver the hydrogen to where it's used? It might be, you build an electrolyzer next to a power plant and feed it directly into it, right? If you're on the Gulf Coast, maybe you take advantage of the existing infrastructure that's there and continue to build it out. So I think just like, Alan's answer earlier, it's going to be a mix of things in order to get the infrastructure to where it needs to be. And the pace of which is driven, I think, by how quickly the demand picture is going to evolve.
So I'm gonna go. Oh, sorry.
I just want to say that there was the big notable shipment that went from Australia to Japan at the beginning of this year. Was it the very first shipment of hydrogen? It was delivered from Australia to Japan, and it faces all the challenges that it's still the lone shipment that broke the ground, and we're waiting to see what will follow. But the expectations are that ammonia will because of the temperature that's needed to liquefy hydrogen. There's a lot of characteristics of hydrogen that make it harder to liquefy and ship.
Hydrogen liquefies at -252, exactly. I think, and ammonia, can be transported at like -33 or something. And ammonia is a denser energy carrier than raw hydrogen is. I mean, your question on converting infrastructure, my honest answer is I don't know. I mean, having worked on both projects, they're similar. Kind of like the storage facilities or double line tanks, or kind of like big thermoses. They got to keep liquids cool. But everything Phil mentioned is true. Like co-mixing natural gas and hydrogen, although possible, most of the natural gas pipeline operators don't want to do it for the reasons Phil mentioned. In terms of, a liquefaction terminal is kind of fundamentally kind of a different process than kind of an ammonia synthesis loop. So, it's just kind of a different process plant altogether. There's similarities, but I think at the end of the day, I don't know if conversion is really going to be as, all that kind of efficient. It may just be, maybe bits and pieces you could use, but wholesale conversion from one to the other may not work.
Going to got a bunch of great questions coming in virtually now, and the one at the top I think is a very good point. It said, hasn't been any mention of the earmarked hydrogen hubs. Do you have any theories on where and when those might be selected and developed? But I think I'll broaden that out a little bit, and if you could also talk about the role of hydrogen hubs in general, and I guess, do you view that as like a catalyzing factor for the development of the hydrogen economy more broadly? And happy for anyone to jump in first.
We've taken a look at it, and it appears that, what the government is trying to do, and I'm stuttering because I've actually kind of read a number of their, publications on this multiple times and still can't quite figure it out, which I think the intent is good. They want to basically incentivize the development of localized demand centers, that is close to hydrogen end use, where people can, produce, transport into, process, potentially store, and then redistribute. It's a laudable initiative. I'm going to be curious to see how it works out in practice. I spoke with someone recently about, when I read what they're looking for in a hydrogen hub, kind of two of the places that stick out to me are kind of the, Houston, the U.S. Gulf Coast region. There's kind of a, native demand center there. And potentially, for example, like places like Southern California, where there's a bit of a niche mobility market. From there, it's never been, I'm paying attention to it to kind of see how it develops, but it's not entirely clear to me exactly what a hydrogen hub is going to look like. I think it's, laudable because it is, we talked about the IRA supply side. I think this is a demand side initiative, but it's not entirely clear to me, how it's going to work yet. So.
Thank you. Do you have any others in the, yeah.
Is there a way to monetize the oxygen?
So question for those joining virtually is there a way to monetize the oxygen produced in the electrolyzing process?
Oxygen produced in the electrolysis. Yes, I would be my answer. Any co-product, right, in any industrial process can certainly be monetized. It goes back to the question of, where your production facilities are and who you're going to sell it to, and what infrastructure do you have in place to do so. So if you're sitting, if you're having a smaller facility close to industrial sites that require, oxygen, or for that matter, any other co-product, there's definitely the demand case there. If you're, kind of relying on a long haul pipeline to deliver the hydrogen, it becomes a little trickier, I think. So I think it's case specific.
So there's a question here virtually I'm going to jump to because it connects to something you kind of touched on earlier, Roman, but didn't explore in much detail, which is, do you foresee a robust trading market for hydrogen emerging in the long run? Just wondered if you wanted to expand on that a little.
I mean, any trading market will develop if there can be a standardized enough commodity and if there's enough arbitrage opportunities, over distances or over time. And if we think about the arbitrage opportunities, I mean, I look at, I mentioned we have daily prices for hydrogen. If we compare our Japanese prices for hydrogen with our Tasmania prices for hydrogen, that's like, it's in the double digits of a differential there. So is that an opportunity for arbitrage? Certainly. I think some of what has to happen is for there to be a resolution for a traded market for hydrogen. There has to be a resolution of the measurement of the carbon intensity, so that you know what product you're getting with what attributes, and if that is a carbon neutral hydrogen, or if it's a hydrogen with a specific attribute that you can then mitigate with a carbon offset, for example.
And how it was determined.
And how it's
standardization around that.
And so there's I mean, given the interest and given the arbitrages, and if you think about, there are parts of the world that have incredibly great insulation or great wind, and if we think about renewables, there's negative power prices to take advantage of. These are the arbitrage opportunities that will lead to the market, as long as, well, the other caveat is that you can move it. Mm-hmm. And that's the big, that's the big key is, the shipment of hydrogen across oceans. The first shipment went out, is that unlikely to be the way it's going to work out. So if the hydrogen can be shipped via ammonia, and then the question is, what do you do at the end? Do you use the ammonia for ammonia's sake, or do you crack it out back to get hydrogen? As long as you can get the netbacks to work, then there's a market to be had. And certainly, if you're looking more locally, if you have either truck shipping or pipeline shipping or other shipping options, if you have a standard commodity and H2 can be a standard commodity, then we do believe that hydrogen or ammonia, and it's a question of which one becomes the more settled established commodity. And to be sure, ammonia is an established market. So a lot of the shipping and a lot of the infrastructure is already in place for that. So it's we're pretty optimistic that we will be seeing much more of a traded market going forward.
Brilliant, thank you for that. I think I saw another hand going there. Yes.
Yes, I'm very interested to hear more about the application of hydrogen steel making. So if you could share a bit more details about whether you see more interest in green or blue hydrogen steel making, and which countries or companies are leading on.
Thank you. So the question for those joining virtually is applications for hydrogen in steel making, whether the panelists can expand on that point a little. Alan or Phil, do you want to jump in first?
And this is green hydrogen or blue, decarbonized. I think Roman alluded to that earlier. And, when we think about large scale applications of hydrogen, the things that come to mind are the biggest CO2 emitters, of today's industry or today's economy. So, steel is on top of that list, and finding ways to incorporate lower carbon hydrogen and being able to sell low carbon steel, I think is going to be one of the leading efforts to provide a hydrogen infrastructure in order to achieve that. That would be my guess. I think that the low hanging fruits are going to be the highest carbon emitters in terms of targets for demand that have significant needs for hydrogen. So I would say it's probably one of the first markets that's going to develop as a pure hydrogen user. But
yeah, and kind of the way steel is produced lots of times now, you have a big vat of molten, iron and a few other things in it. You actually have to put coal of some sort into it to get it to bind with certain things and then make the steel harder, not brittle. What they've discovered is instead of pouring coal into the big vat of molten metal, you can blow hydrogen through it and it accomplishes the same thing. Now, again, lawyer's explanation of a very complicated process. But that's, if you can, finding not using coal in that process and using hydrogen instead potentially has large decarbonization results. And if it's green hydrogen with a lower carbon intensity score, all the better.
And so it's probably not surprising that European steel makers are among the leaders in this space. I know Swedish steel makers, German steel makers have both actually already experimented with pilot projects on this. I mean, it certainly helps their decision making when carbon prices are close to, have hit close to 100 euros at this point. So their incentives to minimize the CO2 impact, the CO2 emissions of their steel facilities are certainly much higher than they are in the United States or elsewhere. So it's yes, and I guess that's the, and then the interesting thing, to go back to a point that we made earlier, is can they monetize that? Can they then sell low carbon steel? And then you have a market, the same sort of market we're talking about for other commodities. We'd have, and actually there already are the makings of a graded steel market on the basis of the carbon intensity. So that's something that we think the Europeans are also going to be spearheading. Make sure if they're going through this effort that they can get any sort of residual valuation from steel users that their product is going to be lower carbon.
Follow-up question. Curious, have you thought there's some discussion earlier, concentrated iron production process, earlier, access to renewable energy, that kind of split the steel production.
The follow-up question here is, will access to renewable energy and some of the practical challenges we were talking about earlier in terms of needing the water and the energy in the right place lead to the concentration of, say, steel production using hydrogen in specific regions where it's easier to access those resources?
I know there's a number of Australian iron and mining companies that have become very, very active in the hydrogen space that are looking at various ways to combine their interest and their capabilities. I can't say I've looked at it specifically, so I don't know that I have a good answer, but it would come down to, the relative advantages of processing in various locations plus shipping, but I don't have any more insight than that, to be honest.
Yeah, I really don't either. I mean, it seems like production of anything and steel included, if you have large deposits of iron or large deposits of coal in one place, you'd be lucky if you find everything you need all in one place. Australia is interesting. They have large iron deposits and large renewable resource, could potentially have something there. I think it's intriguing. And, could it be made to work? Sure. I mean, I'd love to see it happen. So,
and I do believe, I'm trying to think back to the database. I think some of the really large announcements in Australia in terms of the electrolyzer projects were tied to the iron industry.
So we've just got 5 minutes left, and I'm going to jump to one on the chat next that I think is particularly interesting, which is we've talked a lot about incentives, tax credits, negative power prices, etc. It's quite a long question, but the gist of it is, to what extent, when you're looking at investing and financing hydrogen products, do you have to consider the fact that there's an inherent risk over time of subsidies, tax credits, etc., going away?
Yeah.
I think that's one of the challenges that remains to be seen in terms of how we resolve it. Usually, the projects we're talking about are 20-year plus projects, 40-year projects. And, one of the ways I've looked at it is just kind of thinking about the average cost of, the hydrogen production. So yes, it's going to cost, maybe it's going to get the cost down from $5 or $6 to, $2 or $3 for the next 10 years. But then it's going to, PTC doesn't get extended. It's going to go ramp back up, right? So if I want to sell hydrogen, there's two ways I can do it. I can offer it to someone at sort of the weighted average cost, or I structure it in a way where, I pass that risk on to someone else. So I think that's part of, I think, some of the bilateral deals that are going to get done around green hydrogen, that we'll have to come up with new technologies of how that risk is going to be shared. But presumably, if LNG again is an example here of being able to do something under long-term contracts, those are going to be 15, 20-year contracts, and so that risk has to be incorporated and shared somehow.
Yeah. If I chuckled when the question was asked because it just reminded me of something I've mused upon a little bit, and that's 5 years ago or less, the discussions around these provisions and documents focused upon how to allocate liability for carbon taxes. Fast forward today, now everyone wants to own the carbon because you have the rights to the carbon, you can capture it, sequester it, and get $85 per ton. The change of law risk is inherent in any contract. We spend a lot of time negotiating those provisions. There's a lot of different ways to cut them. I think this question maybe foreshadows, what us as lawyers, transactional lawyers anyway, may spend the next few years negotiating, which is, what happens if a project gets put together and banked on the back of 45Q or the hydrogen ITCs or PTCs, and something happens in the subsidy and those programs go away or reduced. I think we can take a fair amount of comfort in the fact that ITCs, PTCs have existed in the renewable power sector for, I think, literally decades. So it's not really a new or novel concept, just taking something tried and true and applying it to other sectors. So hopefully it's not, something we got to worry about too much. 45Q has been around a while. Some of the parameters around how to qualify for it and, the amounts of the credits have changed. So I would hope it's a pretty low risk, but, if parties decide it's a risk that needs to be addressed in a contract, you go back to first principles and we'll, dust off the change of law provisions that we dealt with and were, largely used to allocate, cost in the event a carbon tax is implemented. We can, adapt them for what we're doing here.
Thank you. So going to go to, I think there was a question at the back. Sorry, hand. Yeah, as the last question. Sorry to those in the chat for putting questions. There's quite a volume of them, so we're not going to be able to get to them all. So gentleman at the back.
So you said that hydrogen will be more difficult to get into circulation compared to traditional. Why exactly is that?
Getting electrons into the grid requires building a facility and an interconnect, to the grid at kind of a dumbed down level, and then electrons are fungible. There's nothing really equivalent right now except in a few select places where there are some hydrogen networks, and even those are, for the most part, proprietary. They're not open access. And so producing hydrogen and getting it into mass circulation, I think, as Phil was alluding to, presents an infrastructure question. Like, we're going to need to build stuff to make that happen. It's going to be linear infrastructure. It's going to be fueling stations. It's going to be storage facilities, a lot of which just, other than a few select places, doesn't really exist right now.
I think the one potential, not exception, but the one potential exception that maybe proves the rule is the ability that was mentioned before to blend low levels of carbon into your natural gas pipeline system. Now, volumetrically, hydrogen has a lot less energy per volume than natural gas does. So you got to keep that in mind too, because you lose BTUs as you add to the same volume of blending. But we've seen on the regulatory front, California and some other states consider having a sort of clean gas standard, which would also involve RNG and other opportunities. But so, to the extent, and I know, having spoken to a number of key producers in Europe, it really is specific to how new your gas pipeline system is. Some gas pipeline systems are actually okay to blend relatively higher volumes. Some are not, because of as was mentioned, how small the hydrogen molecule is, and then the brittleness. So there is, in that case, everyone wants to find the sort of drop-in solution that's easy. In some cases there may be, but it's going to be on a case-by-case basis.
And it creates other issues, not issues, but challenges in terms of, so let's say we do add hydrogen to a pipeline. How are you going to get it out? Not everybody and not every end user might be able to use 10% of hydrogen in the natural gas stream, right? So it's going to go into some industrial facilities that are fine. It's going to go to maybe some end users that use natural gas for heating. Maybe that's fine, maybe it's not, right? So you can, once it's in the stream, it's in the stream, and you got to make sure it's usable along the value chain. And I think another challenge along it is kind of converting into electricity again. If you have a power plant in ERCOT, for example, right, and you feed hydrogen into that power plant, you sell into a power pool. The price for power gets set by the marginal producer, so you don't have any impact into what you're selling your product for ultimately. So now if you're adding more expensive hydrogen, there's no reimbursement mechanism necessarily in place in the ERCOT power market. So how do you get reimbursed for having hydrogen in your natural gas stream? So all those things are questions we have to work through.
Wonderful. Well, unfortunately, we have hit time. Just want to say a huge thank you to the three of you for being here. Thank you to everyone in the room as well. I believe there's cocktails after this. I'm getting the nod. Yes, those of you who joined us virtually, I encourage you to have a cocktail yourself. But just for now, thanks all so much, and a round of applause for our panelists.